It was October 1760, and the King of Great Britain, George II, walked into his private chamber for what should have been an ordinary morning. Within minutes, the servants of Kensington Palace would rush inside to find their monarch lifeless. His body collapsed in the most humiliating of places. Not on the battlefield, not in a throne room, but on a toilet dot. This is not the glorious end of a warrior king, but the strange, almost unbelievable story of how the ruler of a global empire was undone by his own body in one of the most private moments imaginable. And yet, behind the humiliation lies a deeper truth about power, mortality, and the way history remembers its kings. Before we uncover this bizarre tale, let me ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments below, because it always amazes me how stories like this connect us across countries and centuries. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and join us, because here on Secret Historians, we bring to life the stories that textbooks left behind. It was October 25th, 1760. The morning at Kensington Palace began in silence, the kind of silence that only great houses carry in their halls before the day's business truly starts. George II, King of Great Britain and Ireland, Elector of Hanover, a man who had outlived wars, rebellions, and political upheavals, awoke to what seemed like just another ordinary day. He was 76 years old, his body weary with age, his reign nearing its close, though he did not yet know it. The sun had barely risen, and the palace staff moved quietly, preparing for the king's routine. George had always been a man of habit. His mornings were predictable. He would rise, say his prayers, take a light breakfast of bread and chocolate, and then attend to the most private of matters in his chamber. For a monarch who had led armies into battle, who had stood at the head of a global empire, this ordinary ritual was perhaps his most human moment. Yet it was here, in this moment of routine, that his story would take its shocking and undignified turn. The king entered his private lavatory, a small chamber adjoining his bedroom. In the 18th century, such places were hardly the grand marble rooms we imagine today, but rather modest, wooden-seated closets, often cold and plain despite being reserved for royalty. He closed the door behind him, expecting privacy. No servant accompanied him. No courtier stood waiting. In this single space, the ruler of Britain was simply an old man with a failing body. Minutes passed. At first, no one thought anything unusual. The king often took his time in the mornings. But then came the sound, a heavy thud, like the collapse of a chair or the fall of a body. The attendants outside rushed to the door, uncertain whether to intrude. Finally, the urgency overwhelmed their hesitation. They forced their way in, and what they saw would forever mark the end of George II's reign. The king was slumped forward, collapsed on the floor, his body twisted, his face pale and lifeless. He had fallen from the commode, striking his head as he went down. The great George II, the last British monarch to lead his troops in battle, had died in the most humiliating of places, on a toilet. The irony of it would not be lost on history. But this moment, shocking, undignified, almost absurd, was not the whole story. To understand why the king's death became so infamous, you must first understand the man himself, the reign he commanded, and the world he left behind. For George II was not merely an old man with a weak heart. He was a warrior king, a ruler of empire, a man both loved and hated, admired and ridiculed. His life was as complex as his death was bizarre. And to understand why his final moments shocked Britain, we must go back to the beginning of his reign, and to the fiery character of the man who would meet so strange an end. George Augustus was born in 1683 in Hanover, a small German principality that at the time was far removed from the grandeur of the English crown. He was not destined to be king of Britain, at least not at first. But dynastic fortune and political necessity would carry him across the sea, into a foreign land, and onto a throne that was not his by blood, but by law. For when the Protestant line of succession grew fragile after the death of Queen Anne in 1714, Parliament looked abroad to ensure the crown would not pass to a Catholic. They found their candidate in George's father, Elector George of Hanover, who became George the First of Great Britain. George the Second, as he would later be known, grew up in this context of divided loyalties, torn between his German homeland and his English destiny. He was often mocked for his thick accent and ridiculed as a foreigner by his British subjects, even after he took the crown in 1727. Yet he was also a man of energy, fire, and passion. He was quick-tempered, often argumentative, and famously stubborn. But he was also courageous, the last of Britain's monarchs to personally lead troops into battle. In 1743, at the Battle of Dettingen, he commanded his men against the French, charging forward with a bravery that shocked his enemies and inspired his soldiers. For a brief moment, George was not just a king but a warrior, and he relished the role. Yet despite his martial spirit, George II was never fully loved. His relationship with his ministers was often strained. He quarreled constantly with Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister, and later with his own son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, whose opposition to him became a national spectacle. He was viewed by many as cold and severe, though those who knew him privately saw a man of deep loyalty to his family, particularly to his wife, Queen Caroline, with whom he shared a genuine bond until her death in 1737. By the 1750s, George was old, his health declining. He suffered from heart disease, his vision was failing, and he was prone to fits of melancholy. Yet he continued his duties, stubbornly refusing to step aside. He read dispatches daily, maintained his routines, and clung to the rhythms of court life. In those years, his empire was expanding across the globe. The 7 Years' War raged, a conflict that stretched from Europe to North America, from India to the Caribbean. Britain was rising as a world power, its navy dominating the seas, its armies clashing with France in distant lands. And so, as George II moved through the twilight of his reign, he did so against the backdrop of a world in transformation. His subjects saw an aging monarch who had once charged bravely into battle, but now seemed more like a relic of an earlier age. Yet no one could have predicted the manner of his end. No one could have guessed that the king who had stood beneath cannon fire would fall, not on a battlefield, but on the floor of his lavatory. Pause for a moment, and imagine the shock that rippled through Britain that October morning. Courtiers rushed to spread the news, their whispers filled with disbelief. Doctors hurried to examine the body, noting the aneurysm in his heart that had burst as he strained, a medical tragedy hidden beneath the humiliation. Ministers gathered in hushed circles, wondering how the kingdom would react when they learned that their monarch had died not in dignity, but in disgrace. The official bulletins, of course, softened the truth. They spoke of a sudden collapse, of the king's heart giving way, of a natural death befitting his age. But behind palace doors, the servants who had found him knew the full story. And gossip has a way of slipping through cracks. Before long, whispers spread of the king found lifeless in his privy, of the undignified end that even royal protocol could not hide. And so, George II entered history, not only as a warrior king, not only as the last monarch to lead his men in battle, but also as the king who died on the toilet. It is a legacy both tragic and absurd, one that raises questions not only about the man himself, but about the way history chooses to remember its rulers. For now, you must hold on to that image of a monarch lifeless on the floor of his chamber and follow the story backward through his reign. Because only in understanding the battles he fought, the family he loved and quarreled with, and the empire he ruled, can you truly understand why his death was not just a private embarrassment, but a symbol of something larger. Something about power, fragility, and the inevitability of mortality. George Augustus did not begin life as a man destined to wear the British crown. Born in Hanover in 1683, he was the son of George Louis, Elector of Hanover, and Sophia Dorothea of Celle. His world was that of German courts, minor principalities, and dynastic marriages far from the roaring politics of London or the imperial ambitions of Britain. Yet even as a boy, George displayed traits that would one day define him as a king: stubbornness, pride, and an almost volcanic temper dot in his youth. George was not considered particularly remarkable. He was of average height, with sharp features, piercing eyes, and a posture that suggested discipline. But beneath his outward composure lay a quickness to anger that frightened even his tutors. He despised being contradicted, hated losing at games, and would sulk for hours if he felt slighted. These traits would follow him throughout his life, sometimes serving him well as a ruler, but often making him enemies in both court and family. His early education focused on languages, military drills, and the etiquette of court life. German princes were expected to be warriors as much as rulers, and George excelled in horsemanship and martial exercises. He admired stories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, imagining himself one day commanding soldiers on the battlefield. He was not a scholar, nor did he particularly care for philosophy or the arts. But when it came to discipline, duty, and the glory of arms, he paid close attention. At the heart of George's early life was his complicated relationship with his father. George Louis, who would later become King George I of Britain, was stern, distant, and often cruel. He saw his son not as a child to be nurtured, but as a tool to be disciplined and molded. Father and son clashed constantly, their arguments echoing through the halls of Hanover. The elder George demanded obedience, while the younger George bristled under authority. This tension would grow into a lifelong bitterness that neither man ever truly resolved. And yet, fate would soon tear George from his German roots and hurl him toward a destiny no one expected. Across the Channel, England faced a crisis. The death of Queen Anne in 1714 had left the crown without a direct Protestant heir. The line of succession was fragile, and Parliament feared that a Catholic monarch might restore papal influence in Britain. The Act of Settlement of 1701 had made it clear: only Protestant heirs could inherit the throne. That law pointed directly to the House of Hanover. Thus, when Queen Anne died, George's father was declared King George I of Great Britain. Overnight, the family was uprooted from Hanover and thrust into the stormy politics of London. For George, this was both an opportunity and a curse. He was now heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, but he was also a foreigner in the eyes of the British people. His thick German accent, his unfamiliar manners, and his sometimes blunt ways made him the subject of ridicule and suspicion. Still, George adapted. He threw himself into his new role with determination, attending court functions, learning the subtleties of British politics, and most importantly, proving himself in the military sphere. Unlike his father, who preferred to stay behind the lines, George relished the chance to lead troops. He joined campaigns against the French, demonstrating not only bravery, but a certain recklessness that worried his commanders. His soldiers respected him for sharing their hardships, eating the same food, and enduring the same weather. He was no distant figurehead. He was present, visible, and engaged. Yet as George's public reputation grew, so too did his private conflicts. His relationship with his father, King George I, deteriorated rapidly in Britain. They quarreled over finances, over court appointments, even over George's wife, Caroline of Ansbach. The disputes grew so bitter that George was eventually banished from court, living separately from his father in open hostility. The tension was so great that when George I died in 1727, his son did not publicly mourn him. Instead, George Augustus ascended the throne as George II, carrying with him both the pride of his new position and the scars of his father's rejection. George II's coronation was not met with unanimous celebration. Many in Britain still saw him as a foreigner, a German interloper who could never truly embody the spirit of the nation. Pamphlets mocked his accent, his temper, and his love of Hanover. Satirists painted him as a man divided, torn between two worlds. But George did not flinch. He threw himself into the role of king, determined to prove his critics wrong. One of the defining aspects of his reign was his partnership with his wife, Caroline. Unlike many royal marriages of convenience, theirs was built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Caroline was intelligent, politically astute, and often served as a mediator between George and his ministers. She softened his temper, advised him on policy, and won the admiration of many in court. With her by his side, George II's reign began with a promise of stability. But stability in the 18th century was always fragile. Britain was expanding its empire, competing with France, Spain, and other European powers for dominance. Wars flared, colonies grew restless, and politics at home simmered with tension. George II would soon find himself tested, not only by external enemies, but by the very members of his own family. His son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, inherited not only his father's position as heir, but also his fiery temper and rebellious streak. Just as George had clashed with his own father, so too would he clash with his son, creating a cycle of bitterness that haunted the House of Hanover. Pause here for a moment. Imagine the weight of the crown on George's head. Imagine being mocked as a foreigner in your own kingdom, despised by your father, and challenged by your son. Imagine trying to rule a nation while your very family conspired against you. This was George II's life, a constant battle, not only with his enemies abroad, but with the people closest to him. It is in these tensions, in these cracks within the royal family, that the seeds of George II's legacy were planted. His reign would be remembered not just for wars and politics, but for the personal dramas that shaped his rule. And as we move deeper into his story, you will see how these personal conflicts mirrored the larger struggles of Britain itself, struggles that would lead to both triumphs and humiliations, culminating in the strange, undignified death that ensured George II's place in history. When George II ascended the throne in 1727, Britain stood at a crossroads. It was a kingdom enriched by trade, its navy expanding, its influence stretching across oceans. But it was also a kingdom divided, filled with political rivalries, religious tensions, and growing whispers of reform. For George, the first challenge was not the enemies beyond Britain's shores, but the ministers who surrounded him at home. At the center of this conflict stood Robert Walpole, the man often remembered as Britain's first true prime minister. Walpole had already dominated politics under George I, and he expected to maintain his influence under the new king. But George II was not his father. He was fiery, quick to anger, and deeply resentful of anyone who tried to control him. Their relationship began in suspicion and quickly grew into open hostility. George bristled at Walpole's dominance. The king wanted to be seen as active in government, not as a ceremonial figurehead. He attended meetings, argued over policy, and demanded respect from his ministers. But Walpole was clever, experienced, and above all patient. He flattered Queen Caroline, who in turn calmed her husband's temper and persuaded him to keep Walpole in office. It was Caroline who reminded George that stability mattered more than pride, that keeping Walpole meant keeping Parliament cooperative. And so, reluctantly, the king tolerated the minister he despised. But George did not simply bow to Walpole. He carved out influence in foreign policy, particularly in matters of war. Unlike many rulers of his era, George II was not content to rule from behind palace walls. He had inherited the instincts of a soldier, and he longed for the battlefield. This desire became reality in the War of the Austrian Succession. Europe was once again thrown into turmoil as dynasties clashed over succession rights, territory, and influence. Britain, bound by alliances and its own ambitions, joined the conflict. In 1743, George II personally led his troops at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany. He was 60 years old, yet he rode into battle at the head of his men, sword drawn, risking his life in the chaos of musket fire and cavalry charges. The sight astonished his soldiers. Here was their king, not distant in London, but charging alongside them through smoke and blood. One account describes him shouting orders with fury, his horse lathered in sweat, his coat stained with mud. Against the odds, the British and their allies triumphed. It was the last time a British monarch would ever lead troops in combat. For his men, it was a moment of pride. For George, it was vindication of proof that he was more than the foreigner mocked in satirical prints, more than the puppet of ministers. He was, in that moment, a warrior king, yet victories on the battlefield did not erase troubles at home. Walpole eventually fell from power in 1742, weakened by scandals and parliamentary defeats. But the king's political struggles did not end there. The factions that replaced Walpole were fractious, filled with rivalries that kept George constantly balancing loyalties. Ministers came and went, each claiming to represent the people, each seeking to bend the monarchy to their will. At the same time, the king's family brought its own storms. His son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, became his fiercest critic. Father and son despised each other openly, their quarrels spilling into public view. Frederick mocked his father in pamphlets, opposed him in Parliament, and courted every political enemy George had. It was a bitter spectacle, one that mirrored George's own youthful conflicts with his father. The curse of Hanoverian kings seemed to be endless war between fathers and sons. The conflict ended only with tragedy. In 1751, Frederick died suddenly of a lung injury, leaving behind his young son, the future George III. For the king, the loss was not only personal, but political. His heir was gone, replaced by a boy who would one day inherit the crown. George II wept for his grandson, but offered little sorrow for the son he had hated. One contemporary wrote that the king's grief was more for the realm than for the man. Meanwhile, the empire continued to grow. Britain's navy controlled the seas, securing trade routes from the Caribbean to India. The East India Company expanded its reach, while settlers pushed deeper into North America, clashing with native peoples and rival European powers. George II presided over this expansion with pride, even as wars drained the treasury and cost countless lives. He saw the empire as proof of Britain's greatness, and by extension, his own. But beneath the victories and the grandeur, cracks widened. The constant wars strained finances, fueling discontent among taxpayers. Political factions sharpened their knives, accusing ministers of corruption and incompetence. Satirists lampooned the king's German accent and fiery temper. And the people, while proud of their empire, began to wonder whether their monarch truly understood them. Imagine living in Britain during this time. You see a king who rides into battle, who leads men with courage, but who quarrels endlessly with his ministers and his family. You hear whispers of corruption. You read pamphlets mocking the king, and you wonder whether the man on the throne is truly the heart of the nation, or simply a symbol of its contradictions. George II's reign was a balancing act between triumph and turmoil, glory and humiliation. And as the 1750s gave way to the 1760s, the cracks widened into fractures. For even as Britain's empire reached new heights, the king himself was aging, his body weakening, his heart faltering. The man who had once led his soldiers into fire would soon struggle with the simple routines of daily life. And it was within those private routines that his fate would be sealed. By the mid-1750s, George II was no longer the fiery soldier king who had ridden into battle at Dettingen. He was an old man, his body frail, his heart weakened, his eyesight failing. Yet even in this state, he refused to retreat from the rhythms of kingship. At 70, he still rose early, still read dispatches from his ministers, still demanded to be kept informed of wars and treaties. Habit was his anchor, and he clung to it with stubborn resolve. But the years were catching up with him. His once sharp temper dulled into irritability, his memory faltered, and his physicians began to worry over his heart. George had long suffered from cardiac problems, irregular beats, pains in his chest, sudden moments of weakness. In an age without modern medicine, there was little that could be done beyond advice to rest and eat moderately. Rest, however, was not in George's nature. He believed inactivity was weakness, and he would not allow himself to appear weak. Meanwhile, Britain itself was changing. The 7 Years' War had broken out in 1756, a conflict so vast it would later be called the First True World War. From Europe to North America, from India to the Caribbean, Britain and its allies clashed with France and Spain for global supremacy. For George, this was both a source of pride and strain. The empire was expanding, its navy dominating the seas, its armies winning victories abroad, but the cost was immense. In London, ministers argued over strategy. William Pitt the Elder, a powerful orator and visionary, rose to prominence, steering Britain's war policy with fiery confidence. George II, though skeptical of Pitt at first, came to rely on his leadership. The king might have been old, but he still cared deeply about the empire's fortunes. He read battle reports with intensity, demanded updates on colonial campaigns, and celebrated victories with almost boyish pride. When news arrived of British triumphs in North America or India, he would strike his cane against the floor and exclaim, "Good, good," like a man half his age. Yet while the empire soared, the king's personal world grew lonelier. Queen Caroline, his beloved companion, had died in 1737, leaving George inconsolable. Though he had mistresses afterward, none filled the void she left. In his later years, he would visit her tomb often, speaking to her as if she could still hear him. Ministers noted that even in cabinet meetings, he sometimes drifted into silence, lost in thought, as though remembering a voice that once steadied him. His family life remained fractured. The death of his son Frederick in 1751 had robbed him of both an heir and a rival. The throne would now pass to his grandson, the young George, who was dutiful but inexperienced. The old king regarded his grandson with a mix of pride and apprehension. He saw in the boy both promise and weakness, and he worried what kind of monarch Britain would have when his own reign ended. By 1759, Britain's victories in the 7 Years' War seemed unstoppable. The French were reeling, their colonies falling one by one. At home, people celebrated Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles when Britain triumphed on nearly every front. Yet the king himself was fading. His body betrayed him more with each passing year. He tired easily, his appetite shrank, and his physicians warned that his heart was dangerously unstable. Still, George refused to yield. Each morning, he rose at 6, drank his chocolate, read his documents, and carried out the same routine he had followed for decades. There was something almost tragic in this stubbornness. Here was a man who had once charged into musket fire, who had thundered across battlefields, reduced now to rituals that masked his frailty. And yet, perhaps it was this very devotion to routine that kept him alive as long as it did. Habit sustained him, even as time stripped away his strength. Imagine walking through Kensington Palace in those years. You would see an aging monarch pacing his chambers, still barking at servants when displeased, still demanding respect, still clinging to the dignity of his crown. But behind closed doors, you would also see the vulnerability of a man who knew his end was near. His physicians whispered of aneurysms, of arteries weakened by age, of a heart that might give way at any moment. The king himself joked grimly about death, saying it would find him in harness, still working, still bound to duty. And in the autumn of 1760, death came. Quietly, almost invisibly, it stalked him through the familiar corridors of Kensington. On the morning of October 25th, George rose as usual, read his papers, and retired to his private chamber. What followed would transform an ordinary morning into one of history's strangest royal endings. But before we return to that fateful moment, we must linger here in these twilight years to understand what they meant. For George II's story is not just about a bizarre death on a toilet. It is about the dignity of routine, the defiance of old age, and the way a king sought to maintain control even as his body betrayed him. His life was a constant struggle between pride and fragility, between public power and private weakness. And in those last years, that struggle reached its most poignant form. When the end finally came, it was sudden, undignified, and unforgettable. Yet perhaps it was also fitting. For a king who had spent his life refusing to bend, refusing to appear weak, death chose the one moment when all men are equal, stripped of crowns and titles. It chose the place where kings and commoners are the same. The autumn of 1760 carried with it the unmistakable chill of approaching winter. In Kensington Palace, the mornings were dim, the air damp, and the corridors heavy with silence. George II, now in his 77th year, continued to cling to his routines with the same stubbornness that had carried him through decades of rule. He rose at 6, prayed briefly, and drank his cup of chocolate before moving to the stack of dispatches waiting on his desk. Reports from ministers, letters from abroad, updates on the war. He read them all, his fading eyes straining over the words. Those close to him could not ignore the signs. His face had grown thinner, his hands shook more frequently, and his steps had lost their old energy. Servants whispered about his failing health, noting the way he tired after even short walks. His physicians cautioned that his heart was fragile, warning that any exertion could prove fatal. Yet George waved them off, insisting he would not live like an invalid. He had been a soldier all his life, he said, and soldiers did not surrender. On the morning of October 25th, 1760, he followed his ritual as always. He read through his papers, nodding at reports of Britain's successes in the war. Then, as he did every day, he excused himself and walked into his private chamber. There, behind a simple wooden door, he expected privacy for the most ordinary of tasks. No courtier followed, no servant intruded. It was a place where he could shed the weight of his crown for a few quiet minutes. But that morning, something went wrong. Inside the chamber, as he sat on the commode, his heart betrayed him. A sharp pain seized his chest, sudden and violent. His vision blurred, his breath caught, and before he could cry out, he collapsed forward. In falling, his body struck the floor with a heavy thud. The sound echoed through the adjoining room. Outside, attendants hesitated. They were trained to respect the king's privacy, but the noise was too alarming to ignore. Minutes passed in confusion, until, finally, they forced open the door. What they found stunned them into silence. The King of Great Britain, the ruler of an empire, lay motionless on the floor of his lavatory. His eyes were closed, his face pale, his wig askew. The commode stood overturned beside him, a grotesque witness to the scene. A servant cried out. Another rushed for the physicians. Panic spread through the corridors as word traveled that something had happened to the king. Doctors hurried in, bending over the body, feeling for a pulse, listening for breath. But it was useless. George II was gone. A ruptured aortic aneurysm, they would later say His heart had simply burst. The scene was at once tragic and humiliating. Here was a king who had commanded armies, who had ridden into battle, who had ruled for more than 3 decades, struck down, not by an assassin's blade or on the field of war, but in the most private of moments. Ministers scrambled to contain the truth, already crafting an official statement that spoke only of a sudden collapse, a natural death. But the servants who had found him knew the full story, and whispers have a way of slipping beyond palace walls. In those first chaotic hours, the palace was transformed into a theater of grief and calculation. Courtiers gathered in clusters, their voices hushed, their expressions strained. Some mourned sincerely, remembering the king's courage and constancy. Others thought ahead to the future, calculating how his grandson George rule. For monarchy is both personal and political, and one man's death is another's ascension. Imagine the shock that swept through Britain as news spread. A king who had lived through wars, rebellions, and scandals was suddenly gone. For ordinary people, the story that reached them was softened, cleansed of indignity. They were told their monarch had died swiftly, his heart failing him in the quiet of the morning. Yet rumors persisted, rumors of the toilet, of the undignified fall, of servants gasping at the sight of their king on the floor of his chamber. It is easy to picture the whispers in taverns, the laughter hidden behind hands, the sly comments of satirists who found dark humor in the manner of his death. But beneath the jokes lay a deeper truth. George II's end was a reminder that no crown, no power, no army can shield a man from mortality. Kings and commoners alike are brought low by the same frailties of flesh. And sometimes death chooses to strike in ways that strip even the greatest of men of dignity. Back in Kensington, the doctors lifted the king's body, preparing it for embalming. Ministers drafted the official announcements, couriers sped to summon the heir, and the machinery of monarchy turned as it always did. Within hours, George II was no longer the king he was the past. His grandson, George III, would inherit the throne, a young man who would lead Britain into both triumph and crisis. But the shadow of George II's death lingered. His reign had been one of contradictions, of bravery and quarrels, of victories abroad and tensions at home. He had been a foreigner who became king, a soldier who became ruler, a man who defied age until his own body betrayed him. And his death, so sudden and so strange, became the final contradiction. A warrior undone in the most private of places. Hold that image in your mind. The corridors of Kensington heavy with silence, the servants pale with shock, the empire's ruler lying lifeless beside the very seat meant for relief. History rarely grants such irony, yet here it did. And it ensured that George II would never be forgotten, not only as the last king to lead his troops in battle, but as the king who died on the toilet. The hours that followed George II's death were filled with a strange mixture of grief, urgency, and calculation. Inside Kensington Palace, the shock of finding the king lifeless on the floor of his private chamber still lingered among the servants and attendants. Yet the machinery of monarchy could not be stalled by shock. Britain required continuity, and the crown would not remain empty for long. Physicians were the first to act. They examined the body, noting the telltale signs of a ruptured aneurysm. There was no mystery about the cause. His heart had finally given way under the strain of age and frailty. Yet the details of where and how it had happened were quietly concealed. Official bulletins described only that the king had suffered a sudden seizure and expired swiftly. The truth, the commode, the fall, the indignity was never meant for the public eye. But secrets have a way of slipping out, and in time the whispers would spread far beyond palace walls. Meanwhile, courtiers moved quickly to ensure a seamless succession. Messengers rode out into London with news of the king's passing, while others hurried to summon his grandson, George, who was now king by right. At just 22 years old, George III found himself thrust suddenly onto the throne of one of the world's most powerful empires. The weight of that moment was immense. He had admired his grandfather, but now he would have to surpass him in the palace. The atmosphere shifted rapidly. Only hours before, George II had been the sovereign, his commands shaping policy and war. Now, his body was being prepared for burial, and his grandson was being addressed as Your Majesty. Such is the ruthless speed of monarchy. One king is mourned even as another is crowned in the same breath. The preparations for George II's funeral were somber but grand, as befitted a monarch who had ruled for over 30 years. His body was embalmed, dressed in royal robes, and laid in state at Westminster Hall. Crowds filed through to pay their respects. For many, it was the first time they had seen their king in person, and the last. His features were pale, softened by death, yet he still bore the stern dignity that had defined his reign. Outside, London was hushed. Shops closed, bells tolled, and citizens draped their homes in black cloth. Yet behind the solemn rituals, there were also whispers of how exactly the king had died. Satirists could not resist the irony. In taverns and coffee houses, jokes circulated about the monarch who had met his end on a toilet. Some mocked him. Others pitied him. But everyone remembered him. Death had given George II what life had often denied him, a story that would never fade from public memory. For the royal family, grief was complicated. His daughter Amelia, who had been especially close to him, wept openly. His grandson, George III, displayed solemn dignity, determined to show the nation that its new monarch would be steady and resolute. Ministers, though respectful in public, breathed privately a sigh of relief. The old king had been stubborn, often combative. Now they looked to a young ruler who, they hoped, would be more malleable. The funeral procession was one of ritual and tradition. On a cold November day, George II's coffin, draped in rich velvet and adorned with the crown, was borne through the streets of London to Westminster Abbey. Soldiers lined the route, their muskets gleaming. Crowds pressed close, straining for a glimpse. In the Abbey, beneath the towering arches, the great and powerful of Britain gathered. Peers, bishops, ministers, all assembled to pay final respects. Hymns echoed through the vast space as the coffin was lowered into the vault alongside Queen Caroline, the wife he had loved so fiercely in life. There was a certain symmetry in this resting place. Though George had taken mistresses, though he had been irritable and quick-tempered, his heart had always returned to Caroline. Even in death, he lay beside her, reunited in stone. For some, it was a reminder that beneath the crown and the quarrels, there had been love. But beyond the Abbey walls, Britain was already looking ahead. George III's reign had begun, and with it came hopes and fears. He was young, earnest, and determined to be a king in his own right. Unlike his grandfather, he was born in Britain, spoke English without a German accent, and seemed more closely tied to the nation he ruled. Many saw him as a fresh start. Few could have imagined the crisis he would face: revolutions abroad, madness within, but that was for the future. For now, George II's death marked the close of an era. He had been the last British monarch to lead troops in battle, a relic of a time when kings fought alongside their men. He had presided over victories and scandals, over family feuds and imperial triumphs. And in the end, his life had been sealed not by glory or conquest, but by the simple, humiliating truth of mortality. Dot imagined standing in Westminster Abbey that day, watching the coffin disappear into the vault. The choir's voices rise, the organ echoes, and you realize that this is the final chapter of a reign that had spanned generations. A man who had once charged through musket fire now lay silent, his story complete. And yet, because of the strangeness of his death, his name would never be forgotten. He had become more than just a monarch. He had become a legend of irony, a reminder that history remembers not only our triumphs, but also our most human, humbling moments. The funeral of George II closed one chapter of Britain's story, but in truth, his death marked the beginning of a new conversation, one that would ripple through generations. The king had reigned for over 3 decades, guiding his country through wars, disputes, and an expanding empire. Yet what people remembered most was not his longevity, nor his victories, but the strangeness of his end. In the weeks that followed his burial, London slowly returned to its rhythms. The bells stopped tolling, the black cloth came down from shop fronts, and life resumed. But in coffee houses and taverns, the whispers continued. "Did you hear how he died?" One man would ask, and another would lean in eagerly. Stories grew with each telling. Some claimed he had choked on his chocolate, others that he had been struck down by divine judgment. The truth that he collapsed in his lavatory was humiliating enough to capture the imagination. Satirists seized upon it. Pamphlets circulated with sly jokes. Cartoons depicted the king in undignified poses, and verses mocked the irony of a warrior monarch undone in such a private act. The government tried to control the narrative, emphasizing the official version of a sudden heart failure, but the people preferred the darker, more human tale. It was a reminder that even kings shared the same frailties as ordinary men. Among the nobility, the reaction was more measured. Many remembered George II as stern but dependable, a man who quarreled with ministers but upheld the Constitution. To them, his death was regrettable, but his reign was what truly mattered. They spoke of his courage at Dettingen, of his devotion to Queen Caroline, of his role in the growth of the empire. But even in their polished accounts, the whispers of the toilet lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Historians, too, faced a dilemma. Some, writing in the years immediately after his death, downplayed the details, choosing instead to highlight the grandeur of his reign. Others, less cautious, recorded the truth, noting that he was struck down whilst attending to nature. Over time, the blunt version gained traction, cementing George II in the annals of history, not only as the last king to lead troops in battle, but as the monarch who died on the toilet. It is worth pausing to ask, why does this matter? Why did his end overshadow so much else? Perhaps it is because death reveals the essence of humanity. In that final moment, titles and crowns are stripped away. George II, who had once been feared by ministers and cheered by soldiers, was reduced to the same vulnerable state as any of his subjects. And people, always drawn to irony, could not resist the contrast. Yet we should not forget the larger legacy. Under George II, Britain's empire expanded dramatically. Victories in the 7 Years, war-secured territories in North America, and India that would shape the future of global politics. The Navy grew into a dominant force, ensuring Britain's control of trade routes. His reign laid the groundwork for Britain's 18th century dominance, even if the credit often went to his ministers rather than to the king himself. Domestically, George II had helped solidify the balance of power between crown and parliament. Though he often resisted, his reign confirmed that ministers, not monarchs, increasingly directed policy. The monarchy was no longer the absolute force it had once been, but a constitutional partner in governance. In this sense, his reign marked a step toward the system Britain knows today. Still, for the ordinary people, it was the manner of his death that endured. Generations later, children would be taught that George II was the last king to fight in battle and the king who died on the toilet. The two facts stood side by side, each a symbol of his reign, one of glory, one of absurdity. Imagine, for a moment, how George himself might have felt if he could have known this. A man so proud, so determined never to show weakness, remembered most for the one moment when weakness overtook him completely. Perhaps it is cruel, yet perhaps it is also fitting. For history does not only preserve our triumphs, It preserves our contradictions. As decades passed, George II's name faded from daily conversation, overshadowed by the reign of his grandson, George III, whose own story would be far more dramatic. The American Revolution, the madness of the king, the loss of empire, these would dominate Britain's memory. But George II lingered in the background, a ghostly reminder of both imperial rise and mortal fragility. Even now, centuries later, his death is still cited in history books, trivia games, and popular culture. His story is repeated not with reverence, but with fascination. Because in the end, George II represents something universal. The truth that no matter how high we climb, no matter what crowns we wear, death finds us all in the same way suddenly, unceremoniously, and often without the dignity we imagined. History is often kind to those who die with grandeur. Kings who fall in battle, emperors who breathe their last surrounded by courtiers, rulers who leave behind stirring last words. These men are remembered as figures larger than life. George, too, by contrast, was remembered for something altogether different. His reign spanned more than 3 decades. His empire expanded, his armies triumphed, and yet his legacy is forever tied to the irony of his death. But perhaps that is what makes his story so compelling. George II was not a legend carved in marble. He was human, stubborn, fiery, flawed, and vulnerable. He fought with his father, quarreled with his son, clung to his routines, loved his wife with rare devotion, and refused to admit weakness even as old age bent him low. He was both king and man, caught in the contradictions of his own nature. His reign mattered. He was the last monarch of Britain to lead troops in battle, a reminder of a time when kings shared the risks of war. Under his watch, Britain laid the foundations of its global empire. Its navy grew dominant, and its territories stretched across oceans. Yet his reign also confirmed the growing power of Parliament, showing that even kings could no longer rule alone. The monarchy was shifting, and George II was the bridge between the warrior kings of old and the constitutional monarchs of the modern age. And still, it is his death that we remember. The image of a king undone in private, struck down in the very moment of ordinary human frailty, has outlived all his triumphs. It reminds us of something deeper, that history is not only about glory, but about irony. That power, however great, cannot erase mortality. That even those who wear crowns cannot choose the terms of their end. Close your eyes for a moment and picture him. The old king at Kensington Palace, rising with the dawn, drinking his chocolate, reading dispatches about an empire stretching across the globe. Picture him walking into his private chamber, unaware that this routine would be his last. And then picture the silence that followed, the stunned faces of servants, the whispers that spread, the irony that would echo for centuries. George II's story is not just about how a king died, but about how history remembers. It remembers the battles, the treaties, the victories, but it also remembers the frailties, the humiliations, the moments that strip away grandeur. And perhaps that is why his name endures, not as a forgotten monarch, but as a figure forever bound to one of history's strangest endings. So I leave you with this question. What do you think matters more in the legacy of a king, the triumphs of a lifetime, or the irony of a single moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective is part of what keeps these forgotten stories alive. And remember, here on Secret Historians, we believe some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish, keep them alive with us.